The moment my husband slid those papers across the kitchen table, I almost laughed out loud. He had arranged them so carefully, the manila folder, the pen placed at a perfect angle beside it, his hands folded on top like he was about to close a business deal. He even wore that blue button-down I used to love, back when I still believed the man wearing it was someone worth loving. He looked at me the way he always did when he wanted something and assumed charm alone would get it, that slow smile, the slight tilt of his head. "It's just a formality," he said. "Sign these and we can move on with our lives." I looked at the papers. I looked at him. And I thought about everything I had spent the last 4 months carefully, quietly putting into place. "I'll need to have my lawyer review them first," I said. His smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes. "You don't have a lawyer." "I do now," I said, and I picked up my coffee mug and walked out of the kitchen. "My name is Rachel. I'm 37 years old, and for 6 years I was married to a man I thought I knew completely. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I met my husband at a fundraiser for a children's hospital, the kind of event where everyone is dressed beautifully and pretending to be more generous than they actually are. He was standing near the bar looking slightly bored, and when I made a joke about the shrimp cocktail, he laughed like I had said something genuinely clever. He had an easy confidence about him, the kind that made you feel like being noticed by him was a small gift. He was in real estate development. He talked about his projects with real enthusiasm, and I found it attractive, that energy. I was 30 at the time, working long hours at a biotech firm, and there was something refreshing about a person who seemed so certain of where he was going. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. I remember thinking, during those months, that we talked about everything: our families, our childhoods, our fears. What I didn't realize until much later was that he talked about everything except the things that mattered most. He never mentioned debt. He never mentioned that his business had been struggling for the better part of 2 years before we met. He never mentioned the credit cards, the private loans, the investor he had quietly been stringing along with promises of returns that weren't coming. I didn't know any of this when I said yes. I didn't know any of this on our wedding day. I found out gradually, the way you find out most devastating things in pieces, each one small enough to explain away on its own, until suddenly you have enough pieces that the picture is impossible to ignore. The first sign came about a year into our marriage. I had come home early from a conference in Boston, and I walked into the living room to find my husband on the phone, speaking in a low, clipped tone that he immediately dropped the moment he heard the door. He said it was a contractor dispute. I believed him. A few weeks later, I noticed an overdraft notice on our joint account, just a small one, easily covered. He said it was a banking error. I believed that too. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters. I wasn't naive. I had a graduate degree. I had managed budgets at work, led teams, negotiated contracts. But there is a particular kind of blindness that comes from loving someone and not wanting to find what you would find if you looked too carefully. I knew something was off. I chose, for longer than I should have, to look away. The second year of our marriage was harder. He became more irritable, more distracted. Small things set him off: a late dinner, a plan changed at the last minute, a question he decided was criticism in disguise. I started walking on eggshells in my own home. I started apologizing for things I hadn't done wrong. My friends noticed. My younger sister said to me once, over brunch, "You seem smaller than you used to." I didn't know what to say to that. I just picked up my mimosa and changed the subject. What kept me steady through those years, even when I didn't fully realize it, was my work. I had been at my company for 9 years at that point, part of a small research and development team focused on a specific class of enzyme inhibitors. It was painstaking, careful work, the kind that doesn't look impressive until suddenly it does. I had co-developed a compound with 2 colleagues, a process that had taken us nearly 4 years of iteration, failure, and refinement. We had filed a patent jointly. I held a 30% stake. At the time we filed, the compound had shown promising results in early trials but hadn't yet attracted serious commercial attention. My husband knew I worked in biotech. He knew I was involved in research. He had no idea about the patent. It had never come up in a way that seemed significant, and honestly, for a long time I wasn't sure it would ever amount to anything. Patents in pharmaceutical research are strange things. They can sit quietly for years and then suddenly become enormously valuable, or they can amount to nothing at all. I had filed it away in my mind the same way you file away a lottery ticket you've forgotten to check. I should have checked sooner. The moment everything broke open was a Tuesday evening in March. I had gotten home later than usual. A department meeting had run long, and when I walked into the house I could hear my husband on the phone again. This time I didn't announce myself. I set my bag down quietly by the door and stood in the hallway. He was in his office, the door not quite fully closed. His voice was tight and controlled in the way it got when he was trying not to raise it. I caught fragments. The timeline has to move, and she doesn't know anything about it, and then, most clearly, just get the paperwork together and I'll handle my end. I backed away from the door. I went upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, washed my face. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought very carefully about what I had heard and what it might mean. By the time I came back downstairs for dinner, my face was calm. My husband kissed me on the cheek and said work had been stressful. I said I understood. I set the table and poured the wine and asked about his day, and the entire time, something inside me had gone very quiet and very focused. That night, after he fell asleep, I went back to his office. I want to be clear, I had never gone through my husband's things before. Not once in 6 years. I had always believed that trust meant not looking. But I had heard his voice on that phone call, and whatever trust I had maintained was already crumbling before I opened the first drawer. What I found took me 3 hours to fully process. There were loan documents, multiple of them, from different lenders, with interest rates that made my stomach turn. There were bank statements for an account I had never seen, one opened 2 years into our marriage, showing a pattern of large withdrawals with no clear destination. There were emails, printed out and folded, between my husband and a man I didn't recognize, discussing a property deal that had gone catastrophically wrong. And there was a legal document, only partially drafted, outlining a plan to refinance our home, the home we owned jointly, without my knowledge or consent. I sat on the floor of his office at 2 a.m. and I understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that the man sleeping upstairs had been lying to me for years. Not small lies. Not forgivable lies. The kind of lies that are actually a separate life, running parallel to the one you think you're sharing. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. I need to tell you about my father, because he is part of this story in a way I didn't expect. My father is a quiet, methodical man, a retired engineer who spent his career building systems that other people relied on without ever knowing his name. He is not wealthy in the flashy sense, but he has always been deliberate with money in a way I admire. When I was growing up, he used to say that the most powerful position you can be in is one where you need nothing from anyone. I used to think that sounded lonely. I understand it differently now. After I found those documents, I called my father. Not right away. It took me 2 weeks to work up to it. 2 weeks of going through my regular life while quietly gathering more information, more evidence, more clarity about the scope of what my husband had done. When I finally called, I drove to a parking lot 3 miles from our house and sat in my car. I didn't know how to start, so I just started at the beginning and talked until I ran out of words. My father was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said, "Have you talked to a lawyer?" "Not yet," I said. "Do that first," he said. "Before you do anything else. And Rachel, call Marcus." Marcus was my father's longtime attorney, a man I had met a handful of times at family events over the years. He specialized in asset protection and family law. I had always thought of him as a background figure in my father's life, not someone I would ever need in my own. I called him the next day. The conversation with Marcus lasted nearly 2 hours. I went through everything I had found, everything I suspected, everything I could document. He listened carefully and asked precise, methodical questions. At the end, he said, "Before we discuss your husband's situation, I want to ask you about your professional assets. Your father mentioned something about a patent." I explained the compound, the filing, the 30% stake. I told him I wasn't sure what it was currently worth, that it had been quiet for years. There was a pause on the line. "Rachel," he said, "I think you should find out." I contacted my patent co-holders the following week, something I probably should have done sooner, but the research team had scattered after the project wrapped, and I hadn't been in regular contact. My former colleague responded to my email within hours. She sounded almost surprised that I didn't already know. A pharmaceutical company, a large one, had reached out to the team's original institution 8 months earlier about licensing the compound. Negotiations had been ongoing. The compound had performed exceptionally well in phase 2 trials that a partner lab had conducted independently. The projected licensing deal was being structured in the range of $18 million, split according to patent stake percentages. 30% of $18 million is $5.4 million. I sat with that number for a long time. My husband had no idea. In 6 years of marriage, the patent had never come up in a way that seemed significant, and I had never flagged it as a meaningful asset. It existed on paper, in my professional records, in my name, entirely separate from our joint finances, entirely unknown to him. Marcus advised me carefully over the next several weeks. He explained what was marital property and what wasn't, what had to be disclosed and when, and most importantly, how to protect what was mine. He walked me through my options methodically. At one point I asked him how he thought the licensing agreement should be categorized, and he said, simply, it depends on timing. And timing is something we can influence. I won't pretend the next 2 months were easy. I was living in the same house as my husband, sleeping in the same bed, having dinner at the same table, while carrying an enormous amount of knowledge I couldn't show. He continued to be distant, irritable in ways he had been for years. He started making small comments about money, how we should tighten up, how I should think about whether my position at the company was really the best use of my time, whether something with a higher salary might make more sense. I understood what he was doing. He was trying to orient me toward a financial conversation he was planning to start on his own terms. There were moments during those weeks when I almost said something. We would be sitting across from each other at dinner, and I would look at his face, a face I had looked at for years, a face I used to find genuinely comforting, and feel a grief that was entirely separate from anger. Grief for the version of the marriage I had believed in. Grief for the person I had thought he was. I allowed myself to feel that, privately, in the car or in the shower. In the small quiet spaces where I didn't have to manage my expression. And then I set it aside and kept moving. The papers he slid across the kitchen table on that Thursday evening were, it turned out, a quitclaim deed. He wanted me to sign over my half of the house temporarily. He said, for refinancing purposes, it would all come back to me once the deal was restructured. He explained it calmly, as if it were completely reasonable, as if I were someone who would simply nod and pick up the pen. When I told him I had a lawyer, his composure cracked slightly at the edges. He recovered quickly. He said he didn't understand why I needed a lawyer for a simple paperwork matter between a husband and wife. I said I just wanted to make sure I understood everything fully before I signed anything. He said he didn't appreciate me being difficult. I said I hoped he had a good evening, and I went upstairs. I called Marcus from the bedroom. He already knew about the deed. I had told him my husband was likely to make this kind of move soon. Don't sign anything, he said. Not a word, not a signature. We're almost ready. 3 days later, I filed for divorce. I chose a Thursday, which felt unremarkable on purpose. I had moved the things I needed: my documents, my laptop, a few boxes of personal items I had quietly taken to my sister's house over the previous 2 weeks, and I had arranged to stay with her while the legal process moved forward. I did not tell my husband in advance. I did not leave a note. I had my attorney file the papers, and that afternoon I drove away from the house we had shared for 5 years without looking back in the rearview mirror. My husband called 11 times that evening. I let every call go to voicemail. The messages started confused and moved quickly to angry. He wanted to know what I was thinking, who had put me up to this, why I was being so dramatic. In the last message he left that night, he said, "You're making a huge mistake. You can't handle this on your own. You have no idea what you're doing." I listened to all 11 messages sitting at my sister's kitchen table, drinking tea. When the last one ended, I set my phone face down on the table and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I could breathe all the way down. The divorce proceedings took 7 months. My husband hired an attorney who was aggressive in the way that attorneys are when their client believes he still has leverage. There were discovery motions and counteroffers and tense conference calls. My husband's legal team made much of the marital debt, attempting to establish that I shared responsibility for obligations I had never agreed to and never known about. My team made much of the fraudulent refinancing scheme, the hidden account, the years of financial deception. At some point during discovery, my husband's attorney learned about the patent. I was told later that my husband's reaction, when his lawyer informed him of the licensing deal and the $5.4 million, was explosive. He had apparently slammed his hand on his attorney's desk and said the money was marital property and he was entitled to half. His attorney, to her credit, apparently explained that intellectual property developed prior to and during marriage under professional employment had specific legal protections, and that a 30% stake in a patent filed under the auspices of my employer's research division had a strong argument for classification as separate property, particularly given that he had been unaware of it for the entirety of the marriage, meaning it had never been commingled with marital assets. He didn't get half. He didn't get a quarter. What he got, after 7 months of proceedings, was a settlement that accounted for the legitimate marital assets we had actually shared, a figure substantially reduced by the debt he had accumulated fraudulently in both our names. When the accounting was complete, he owed far more than he was owed. The house was sold. The proceeds went primarily toward resolving the debts he had created. He walked away with considerably less than he had imagined, and considerably less than he deserved to keep. I walked away with my patent stake, my career, my savings that I had maintained in my own account, and a clarity about my own life that felt like something I hadn't had in years. There is a postscript to this which I almost didn't include because it still makes me feel something complicated, not regret, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of waste, maybe. Of all the years. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was my ex-husband. He had gotten a new number, which was why I hadn't recognized it. He sounded different than he had during the proceedings, flatter, more subdued. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he wanted me to know he understood, now, how much he had put me through. He said he missed me. I stood at my kitchen window, my own kitchen now, in the apartment I had rented with money entirely my own, and I listened to him talk for about 2 minutes. When he paused, I said, carefully and without particular emotion, "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you do well." And then I said goodbye and hung up. Because here's what I have learned, and what I want to say directly to anyone listening to this who is in a house with someone who makes them feel small. The moment you start rebuilding is the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who were never really listening. My ex-husband wanted to apologize, yes. But he also wanted something from me, absolution maybe, or the comfort of knowing I still thought about him. What I gave him instead was a door, gently but completely closed. The licensing deal finalized 6 months after the divorce. The paperwork was smooth and professionally handled and entirely unrelated to my marriage. I took a portion of my share and paid off my own debts, the student loans I had been slowly chipping away at for years. I put a significant amount into savings. I donated to 3 organizations that help women navigate financial abuse situations, because I know now how common it is and how invisible it can be when you are inside it. My father came to visit me in my new apartment in the spring. We sat on the small balcony with coffee and he looked out at the street below and said, in his quiet way, "You did good." I told him I had a lot of help. He shook his head slightly. "You did the work," he said. "Help is just help." I think about that sometimes. The way we are taught, especially as women, to credit circumstances and other people for the things we actually built ourselves. I had a good attorney. I had a father who gave me a phone number at the right moment. I had colleagues who had maintained a patent we all believed in. But I also made the choice to stop looking away. I made the choice to sit on that floor at 2 in the morning and face what was in those drawers. I made the choice to protect myself quietly and completely before I showed my hand. My ex-husband once told me, early in our marriage, that I was too cautious, too careful, that I needed to learn to take more risks. He was not wrong that I was careful. But careful is not the same as passive. Careful is not the same as weak. Sometimes careful is what keeps you standing when everything else is falling. And sometimes it is what allows you to walk away from a burning house without getting burned. I still work at the same company. I was promoted last year to lead a new research division. The work is hard and absorbing, and on the best days it feels like exactly what I am supposed to be doing. I have a small garden on my balcony that I tend badly but enthusiastically. I have dinners with my sister on Sundays that I never miss. I have, slowly and deliberately, rebuilt a life that belongs entirely to me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I spent in that marriage, And my honest answer is not exactly. I regret the specific choices I made to ignore what I sensed. I regret the version of myself that kept apologizing for things that weren't her fault. But I don't regret what those years ultimately made me understand about patience, about documentation, about the particular kind of strength that comes from deciding you are done and then moving without hesitation. My ex-husband thought those papers on the kitchen table were going to be the end of my options. He had been running the game his whole life on the assumption that the people he underestimated weren't paying attention. I had been paying attention for a long time. I was just waiting until I had everything I needed.